Hello, I'm Dr. Younger. I'm director of the Neuroinflammation, Pain, and Fatigue Laboratory. And today I want to cover an important paper that just came out, and it's looking at cognitive function in ME/CFS, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Almost everyone with ME/CFS will report that the ME/CFS has had a negative impact on their cognitive function, but there is pretty little research using established cognitive tests in ME/CFS. There are some for sure, but there's just not a lot of it. So this paper helps address that gap in the scientific literature. What are the cognitive impairments that are caused by ME/CFS? So this paper was led by Dr. Lang, who is the ME/CFS cognition expert. She's a neuropsychologist who's worked in this field for a really long time, and she's a strong champion for conducting proper cognitive testing in ME/CFS patients. So let's take a look at the paper. The paper is Cognitive Assessment in Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, ME/CFS, a cognitive sub-study of the multi-site clinical assessment of ME/CFS, or MCAM. Now, this is an open access paper, which is great. That means that everyone can read this paper in full if they want to, and I've put a link in the description where you can find and download and view that paper. So what we have here is 426 participants. 261 of them have ME/CFS, and 165 are healthy subjects, and that's a good sample size. Right off the bat, we should give this study a good bit of attention because of the sample size. It's a healthy, strong study with a lot of participants. So unless we find a problem with the methodology or the analyses or the interpretation, this paper is going to significantly advance our understanding in the field. Now, why should we care about cognitive tests to begin with? Well, first of all, it tells us whether we need to be using cognitive rehabilitation in ME/CFS, if that's something that we need to be treating, like patients often claim or report. It also helps tell us what specific harms there are to ME/CFS, and it can also give us a clue on the pathophysiology of the disease, like what parts of the brain perhaps are affected by ME/CFS, and that may tell us what to look at, where to look, and what treatments may ultimately potentially help the condition. Now, this study is as you can see, there's a patient group and there's a healthy group, so it's a patient versus healthy. But this study did something extra, which is really interesting, and that is they did a longitudinal design. So everyone took the tests more than once. And what's particularly interesting is they did the test at a clinic, say in the morning, and then they did a bunch of other tests, including exercise tests or physical functioning. And then they tested the cognitive ability again. And that can tell us if sustained effort has a negative impact on cognitive functioning in ME/CFS, where it doesn't in healthy controls. And so the physical test they used was a kind of an stationary exercise, standard exercise bike test of kind of your cardiopulmonary function. And that's something that is known to cause an exacerbation of fatigue and other symptoms in ME/CFS. So it's a good test to use. So this protocol can elicit post-exertional malaise in the participants. And the hypothesis would be if someone has performed cognitively or physically and they have post-exertional malaise, they will do worse on cognitive functioning tests. So they brought them in the clinic. They did a computerized battery of tests, which is called the Cog State Brief Screening Inventory or Battery. So it's the CBSB. I've not used that. I've used other computer-based exams, but I have not used this one. So I'm not familiar with it. I'm familiar with the tests, but I've never used this. It's something where you can administer it in the clinic. And what's really good about it is it's pretty easy to administer it at people's homes. So you can look at how they perform in the lab and actually do it at home as well. And as you know, if you follow my videos, I really like designs where people can do as much of it as possible in their house because it's just more practical and more patients can do the study. And so this is one of those tools where you can do cognition tests at home. So they did the test 5 times in 5 different time points. And I want to show you the time points right now. So there's T0 through T4, or time 0 to time 4. So time 0 is the first in the morning. They're in clinic session. So before they do anything else, that's the first time point. T1 is toward the end of their clinic visit after their exercise test. Then T2 is approximately 9 hours after they got home from their session. Then T3 was 24 hours after they got home, and T4 is 48 hours after they got home. And the purpose of the 24 and the 48-hour time points at home are to examine the possibility that PEM, or post-exertional malaise effects on cognition, are delayed. We hear it reported a lot from ME/CFS patients that the worst PEM symptoms don't come around until some period of time. It could be 1 day, 2 day, 3 days. And so the research team wanted to make sure that they're not missing that possibility, that maybe the cognitive insults or the cognitive impairments they may not exert themselves. They may become obvious right after the exercise test. So it may be that you need 24 or 48 hours after doing the exercise test before you see these PM related issues. So I hope that's clear. Now, I did want to note really quickly that not all the ME/CFS patients did the exercise testing. It looks like about 70%. So most of them did. But I believe one of the sites, this is a multi-site study, one of the sites didn't have the setup, or they weren't able to do the exercise testing. And so that part was omitted. So there's analyses that take that to account. I won't dig into the study that deeply because it would take too long, but I just wanted to let you know that not all the patients did the exercise testing, unfortunately. So that complicates the analyses a little bit. Now, there's other minor notes in the paper as well. There's quite a few, but like I said, this is an open access paper. So if you're really interested in knowing all the ins and outs of the study, you can access the paper and read it. Now, there were 6. So I mentioned that you do the battery 5 times. Every time the battery was done, there were 6 different tests that were being administered. And these are selected from a battery of possible tests. So there are many different cognitive tests they could have done, but they picked ones that have been reported to be sensitive to ME/CFS in the past. So they pick things where we have some preliminary or prior data, and so they can compare the results they get with the studies that have already been published. So I'm going to show you right now the 6 cognitive tests. It would take too long for me to go through each one of these and really give you a good description. So I'm only going to give you the kind of most basic description of what these tests are. So first we have the detection task, and this is a test of reaction time. So it's the most simple task. It's basically you see a stimulus and you have to hit the button as fast as you can. So just how quick can you react when you see something? So very basic psychomotor speed. Then we have the identification task, which is just a little more complicated. You're trying to react to a stimulus, and it's just testing whether you visually can pay attention to a task for some period of time. Then we have the one-card learning task, which is more recognition learning, and this task will show you some, I don't know if they use cards or what kind of stimuli they use, but it'll show you a set of pictures or cards or letters or numbers, and then you're presented a card and you have to identify whether you've seen that before. And so you have to be able to kind of learn previous exposures to different stimuli. Then we have the one back task, which is simple working memory. And this is a task where you have to say yes or no when you're given, say, a letter like A. You have to say whether or not the previous stimulus you were given was the same thing or not, whether it was also an A. So it's pretty basic. It just requires you to keep a previous stimulus in your head in working memory while you react to a new stimulus. Then the two-back task is a more complicated version of that, where you have to hold more information in your head because you have to remember back 2 stimuli when you're reacting to whether you've seen this new stimulus or not. And then there's maze learning, which is the by far the most complicated task in this set, and it requires a lot of different cognitive skills. Globally, we'll call this executive function, so kind of prefrontal um, activity where you have to. I try to describe this one. It's not like a classic maze, like a mouse or a rat running through a maze. It's more of a grid, and it's kind of an invisible maze, but you have to figure out your path from start to end, which has already been predefined, but you don't know what it is. And it gives you feedback, and you have to be able to learn from that feedback and plot your way through that maze. So it requires a lot of cognitive functioning to get through that. Now, some of these tests are simple, as I said, some are more demanding, but really it depends on the nature of the deficits you may have. So if you had brain damage in a specific area of your brain, it could affect some tests more than others. Now let's look at the results. And the big caveat here, I guess, is there's a few caveats. Main one is that results in cognitive studies can be tricky. There's different groups. As I mentioned, there are subgroups because not everyone did the same exact thing. There are multiple time points. There's different tests. There are different ways to score the test. So you can look at reaction time. You can look at accuracy. And it gets to where you can have dozens or potentially even hundreds of statistical tests. And of course, it would take hours to go through a large number of tests and try to interpret each one. This paper has a supplement section with additional important tests. So there's just too much to discuss everything. So I'm just going to kind of pick what I think is the essential tests for testing the main hypothesis. So all that together, just the basic story. If you want the full story, the paper covers everything in more detail. And again, there's tests and analyses that I'm not going to cover here. I'm not even going to mention some of the tests here. So do look at the paper for more. I will note that if you don't have a research design or a statistical background, you will probably find some parts of the paper difficult to get through because of some of the ideas, and some of the language can be a little tough if you haven't seen it before. But of course, you're welcome to download it and take a look. So here's the main results figure. And I'm going to focus on the simplest task, which is reaction time. Just how quickly do you hit a button after you've seen a stimulus? Let me zoom up right here on that task. And what we see here is when we look at the T0 time point, which is the first test in the morning, I put that in a green circle. There's no significant difference between ME/CFS and healthy controls. By the way, lower, so the healthy is black, ME/CFS is red, and lower is faster, which is better. So we're actually looking for the lower score is the better score. And if scores are getting lower and lower, that means the person or the group is improving because their reaction time is getting faster. It takes longer for them to react to the stimulus. Now, the way we know that the groups are not different at T0 is because we look at these error bars. We've got the red and the black-blue bars. They overlap at T0, which means the groups are not different. So the groups become significantly different when the bars diverge, when they don't overlap. So right here, we can see that ME/CFS and healthy control groups perform similarly when they come in to do this reaction time task. But that changes when we start to look at the subsequent tests. At the end of the clinical session, there's now a difference. Now it's barely, but there now is a difference between the groups, with the ME/CFS group doing worse significantly than the healthy controls. And that difference grows even larger after the participants go home, with the greatest difference being at 48 hours after the clinical visit. The major implication, I think, here is that doing a single in-clinic test may not show a cognitive problem that is actually there. Now, is this delayed post-exertional malaise or PEM? My initial interpretation of these data is that this is not PEM, and that's because I don't see a dramatic worsening of the tests in ME/CFS. Rather, to me, it looks like ME/CFS is not showing the learning practice effects that the healthy control do. So we can see this slight improvement over time in the healthy controls that we don't see in ME/CFS, but I'm not seeing this dramatic worsening of the reaction time. Now, maybe this is what post-exertional malaise looks like on this test, but I just want to note that we don't see that there's been a huge crash of their cognitive ability in this regard. And by the way, in the other tests as well, I don't see anything that looks like a crash, a significant crash of cognitive function. That's one thing that I don't think these data reflect. So anyway, let's go back to the main figure here. And this story I just told you with there's no significant difference at the first time point, but then there is in subsequent time points. That is the story for other variables as well. But then some other ones show the difference right at the first, like this one right here. This is the recognition learning task. And you can see that on this task, ME/CFS patients are already worse at the very first time point. The difference becomes even more striking with more complicated tasks. So the two-back working memory task, this requires more cognitive processing to do this successfully and to respond quickly to this. Now also, so I put this now in the circle right here so you can see that one. So we're seeing a bigger difference between patient and control groups. Now the paper also reports a big difference in the maze results, which is the most complicated task. But I have a question about this figure. And until I get that question answered, I don't feel comfortable interpreting these results. I sent an email to Dr. Lang, but it's a Sunday when I record this, and she didn't have a chance to respond. I don't expect people on a Sunday to be checking their email every 30 minutes and responding to random questions. So I'm going to hold off on interpreting the maze task. The general thing I'm seeing in these results is that the difference between ME/CFS and healthy controls seems to increase with the complexity of the tasks. So tasks that are really, really simple, we see less of a difference between ME/CFS and healthy control, but tasks that require a lot more cognitive processing and more effort, we start to see the groups diverge even more. And that means, I mean, the implication for clinicians is that the cognitive tests that they use may not be adequate for detecting cognitive problems in ME/CFS because the cognitive tests that are used in most clinics tend to be very simple. And so that may need to be revised when you're looking at ME/CFS. That's the main story. I mean, there's really, as with most scientific papers, there's a lot more here. But really, the videos get to be too long and it just gets to be too complicated to go through everything, unfortunately. My general assessment of the study, I think the design it's well designed. It's good. Good sample size, as I've already noted. The results agree with previous reports, previous studies that are similar, and the conclusions were appropriate. So it's a good study. This really comes down to, if I wanted to say, what's the main point? What's the takeaway? It's this. When ME/CFS individuals say that their cognition is impaired, they are right. It is objectively worse on standardized tests, and it affects multiple types of cognitive ability. It's not just one little task or function that's being impaired. It is a range of function. So what that means clinically is that proper comprehensive cognitive testing should be a part of diagnosing ME/CFS, or I guess doing a clinical workup of ME/CFS, not really diagnosis, but it should be an important part of conceptualizing the problem in an individual, and it should be tracked over time to look at how it's changing. I think that's the best way to say it. The cognitive testing should be part of the care of someone with ME/CFS, and that is not how it's done in most places now. So that is something that probably needs to change. Now, how severe is the cognitive detriments or impairments? That's hard for me to assess with how the data are presented in this paper, but Dr. Lang and other neuropsychologists can interpret the significance of the detriments. So that's the main thing from this paper. So I just wanted to, instead of presenting some of my own data, which we typically do. And we also have some cognitive data that we're presenting at a conference in a month or so. And I will do a video on that in the future. But I just really, when I see good papers come along, I do want to present them and point those out and give you a chance to get a hold of these and take a look and see if it could be helpful. So that's the main thing I wanted to say about this paper. I hope that's useful, and I will be back next week with some more study results for you. Talk to you soon. Bye.